Alrighty, well, thank you everyone for sticking around this long after lunch. Depending on what you ate, it's probably a good time for a nap, but instead you decided to take a nap in here while I drone on about advanced Visio techniques and a bunch of governance frameworks. Slight title change from the program, but it's the same talk. I just realized that the ultimate thesis of this is actually kind of what Matt talked about earlier, so it really lined up that think like an adversary. I think we don't do that enough as an industry. Well, I don't want to give my whole talk before I give my talk. So yeah, adversarial thinking using threat modeling to develop a cognitive map of your security posture. Probably could make that a bit shorter, but you know. Yes, this is the Narcos intro. I'm going to give examples in this talk. If they are in any way resemble any client I've ever had or any company I've ever worked at, no, they don't. Nope. If I talk about Pablo Escobar, different one, completely made up. If I slip and say a company name that may show up on my LinkedIn, maybe I'm a chronic liar, we don't know. So, yeah, everything purely hypothetical, none of this is real, and I'm definitely not giving real life examples, even if it seems like I am. Who am I? Hudson Bush. Find me on pretty much any social that hackers are on at HomebrewedSec. I do not post anymore. I am in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Beautiful drive up, by the way. I love this area. I love that y'all are doing this. Super great place to be. I'm a bit in transition. It says I'm at Securi, but in like a week that will not be true, and I'll be at Critical Start, still doing the same general thing. So that's not important, but the slides background would probably change a bit if I was giving this talk in a week. So this may be one of those slides that gives you a little bit of like trauma or a little bit of therapy. If you work on the defense side, if you have worked with defenders. I think that honestly these slides might be understating it a bit. The reality is to say that we strategize at all in a lot of teams is probably is probably a little over generous. I think a lot of times, I say it down here random, it sparked joy. That's kind of a joke, but I do think that most people do security by Marie Kondo. It's, you know, and it could even be like the ADHD, like, you know, dopamine hit. Ooh, that sounds fun. I read an article about that. I want to do that. Or this is what I woke up wanting to do. That is how we generally do things, or the best is the historical bias. I've never done it that way before, so I'm not gonna, or I've always done it this way. I cannot tell you how many dozens, if not hundreds of times, I've heard someone say, this is the next thing we need to implement because when I worked at Pepsi 20 years ago, that's what we first implemented. I'm sorry, what you implemented 20 years ago probably is not the same order you want to do it today. Things are different. Perimeter might have actually been like a valid security model, you know, when you were doing that, it's different. So I don't need to go too much into this, but I think this is the context of like we're firefighting. We're like, oh, my meltdown inspector in the news, let me patch those. Yeah, if you spent weeks redirecting your security team to fix Spectre and Meltdown, I guarantee 99% of you work at a place where no one is ever going to do speculative execution against your systems. And congratulations, you just slowed down all of your servers by like between 1 and 10%. Great. Good for you. And this whole talk is about how to actually create a strategy, how to actually think about these things in a cognitive, thought-through way. So before I even get into what is attack path mapping, why? Why does this talk exist? Well, because of the slide I gave you 2 slides ago, which is we're like securing by vibes. This quote by John Lambert at Microsoft is the whole talk here. Defenders think in lists, attackers think in graphs. As long as this is true, attackers win. We think in lists like asset inventories or risk registers. Those things aren't bad. We have to have those as lists. But what if you conceptualized your asset inventory as if you got to this asset, you could then get to this asset. Or you conceptualize your risk register as this risk plus this risk equals super bad risk. But this risk plus this security control means that risk isn't a big deal. And I've seen that too often where like this is a critical risk in like hypothetical land, but you never actually look at your systems. You never actually look and say, could this actually happen? So it's critical and you talk about it all the time because it's on the risk register, but you don't map it. So not saying get rid of lists. Excel is always going to be either the first or second best tool for any job. Chances are your defenders use Excel more than they use your SIM. I've seen it too often where it would take so long to do a query in Splunk that you just export it to CSV and you manipulate it in a pivot table. So that we are never going to get rid of lists, but we need to be thinking in graphs. We need to be conceptualizing our systems as attack paths, as, you know, as graphs. So as long as this is true, attackers win. That sounds like hyperbole, but I really don't think it is. I think it's what we're doing isn't working, and we need a new way of thinking and prioritizing. So I feel like I've just in talking about what is attack path mapping, I've already probably said why, but let's be a little more explicit about it. Like I said, shift to graph thinking. Let's adapt that attacker mindset. The reality is we defend in depth. Why don't we analyze in depth? Why don't we use every tool available to us to conceptualize our environment, data-driven? Because like I've been saying, the reality is we do not actually use data, and the data exists, but we don't use it in our strategy. We may use it in other things, but we generally, when we're saying we're gonna implement this control, this control, this control, we generally don't use data. And then enhanced communication, everyone learns differently. Some people are visual learners, and visualizing things, I can't tell you how many times it like has clicked in my brain. The moment I put something on an attack graph, I'm like, wait, this plus this plus this, I thought that wasn't important. Suddenly I'm looking at it and I'm like, holy, like, and then other things that I thought was like sky is falling, you put it on the graph and you're like, wait, that'd never work. Why? Yeah, you can get one system, but cool, you got one system. You didn't pivot. So enhanced communication, you're communicating at different people's levels. Now I will say, and I say this over and over in this talk, is that the version of an attack graph that you present to a peer on the security team or a defender or even a CISO is very different than if you were to ever present this to a CEO. Even if your CEO is technical, they don't want to see all the stuff. You probably need multiple versions of this, but enhanced communication, it just shows I have thought through this process. It shows I'm not just saying this is a big deal because it's checking off some box off CIS. It's, you know, saying I have analyzed and you could very feasibly get from here to here. I've also seen a lot of times you visualize that and you go, holy, that is a big deal. You drop what you're doing, you close the program, and you go get that thing fixed. It's no longer important to map this, it's more important, you're like, I just realized it, let me just fix it. So here, I will actually, this is the first time I've given this talk where I've had enough time to do a demo, which I'm gonna say is probably the most boring, least technical demo that anyone has ever given in the history of security demos, but I think it's interesting, and I think it's one thing for me to just say, hey, draw pretty graphs, but it's one thing for me to say, here's what a pretty graph looks like. So you don't need to actually have to read this. It's just an example while I talk a little more. Prerequisites. Before you even start with attack path mapping, the more I say that, it sounds like a tongue twister. And it's one of those, I'm gonna say it so many times it won't sound like a real phrase by the end. Prerequisites, crown jewel analysis. You need to know what you're protecting. Same thing with asset inventory. If you start this and you don't, like you start this the first week you work somewhere and you don't know what it is that exists, you're probably not gonna create good graphs. You're not gonna actually conceptualize this right. And then define your perimeter. I know that's really hard to do, but it may be identity-based. You may actually have most of your stuff on-prem in a way that you could define your perimeter, but define what that initial access looks like, what that barrier that a attacker has to do to get into your environment. And part of that is you can only do that so far until you actually start putting things on this graph. So the process, this isn't some sort of framework, this is just how I do it and how I conceptualize things. There are a lot of threat modeling frameworks out there. I'm not trying to create the 7,000th threat modeling framework, but brainstorm the attack path. The way I started this sounds like a joke, and it probably says more about my mental state than it does about how to actually do this. I had been thinking about how to communicate a certain risk to the CEO to get buy-in, and I've been thinking about it for weeks. And I woke up at about 1:30 in the morning. I'm not kidding, fever dream, fever sweats. And I went down to my computer and I worked until about 9 in the morning. And I wrote out a list of every single initial access vector that an attacker could use to get into our systems, okay? Wake up and, people are jumping on a Zoom call with me and I'm like, look what I did. And they're like, what the hell are you doing? So that's probably not the way to do it, but you know what flaws are in your system. You know what keeps you up at night, what wakes you up at 3 in the morning in a cold sweat. And by the way, that document, we referred to it till the time I left as the fever dream document. It was like the blue team equivalent of a manifesto. Totally incoherent in first draft, but one of those things is it's just journaling. I mean, and I say journaling in the almost like self-help mental health way. Just brain dump the things that scare the crap out of you. Brain dump the things that you're like, this is what I think an attacker would use. And a lot of your assumptions will be challenged as you do these things, but technical and non-technical vectors. The reality is attackers are getting in through super non-technical ways. They're just calling people on the phone and saying, give me your password. I mean, doesn't get less tech, or stealing someone's device. Think about those things as well. I think a lot of times we want to think about the cool, sexy attacks. We want to think about the real technical stuff, the real hypothetical stuff, because that's fun to think about. And it's not fun to think about what if someone doesn't lock their car door and their laptop bag gets stolen. But that's a very realistic way to get into a system. It's the most realistic way in a lot of environments. MITRE attack. Once you have then said, these are all the things I've conceptualized, MITRE attack gives you the verbiage so you can standardize this language. You start saying, well, this looks like this initial access, this looks like, this part of initial access, it looks like phishing, blah, blah, blah. And then it makes you think, ooh, I didn't think about that. But now that I'm looking at the different types of, lateral movement, things like that, it gives you more and more ideas. And just to continue the theme of MITRE, defenses. You may have a really good idea of your defenses and your controls, and you should map that on this diagram. MITRE defend, really under hyped MITRE tool. Sometimes it's real esoteric naming of some of the defenses, but it gives you a lot of ideas like, oh, I do have that defense, or I hadn't thought of that type of defense. But it's a really cool technique, a really cool tool set they have. And then this is the good way to identify those gaps. Say, what I like to do is on this mapping, for every attack path, you say, here's our current controls that could influence and stop this, and here's the proposed controls. So use this to identify your gaps. And then the seriously most important part is socialize this, get outside perspectives. The reality is, a lot of times as defenders, we're in kind of this box, this bubble of here's this hypothetical, but you start talking to the IT team, the DevOps team, you start talking to other people, and they're like, that could never happen because we have this control that you didn't know exists. So challenge your expectations. Don't just start presenting this to CISO, and then he's like, well, the IT team told me that couldn't happen because of this, and then you're like, now you're looking like an idiot because you didn't actually talk to your peers. So don't look like an idiot, at least not for preventable reasons, because you're gonna look like an idiot sometime. I've talked about this a bunch, but you need multiple versions of this type of presentation. Security leadership is going to be different than internal for you and your peers. There's going to be different for IT, who understand the technical, but maybe don't care about some of the more esoteric attack paths, and then execs totally different. You could have so many more versions of this. So let us try this demo. Let's see how this works. First, nope, that is not showing. So 1 second, let me fix my present mode. Probably should have tested that a slight bit more. And boom, okay. So first, I want to talk about MITRE ATT&CK. I never want to assume that people know a tool.
We need to save here.
No, did I not? Did I not hit save? Oh man. Thank you. Okay. Okay, boom. Keep changes, perfect. Now you see it, okay. Okay. So I never want to assume that people know a tool that is fundamental to me. So you may never have actually used MITRE ATT&CK. Use it. One of the important distinctions that I like to make that I think people misuse MITRE ATT&CK is that this is not a listing of every single way you can get attacked. I think a lot of people think that this is a list in that way. It's supposed to be used more as a shared language, a shared ontology. So you may be able to think of a dozen more types of initial access that are not on here. I actually can, but that's not the point of this. But I still like to start here because initial access, my creativity only goes so far. I'm not an attacker, I'm not a red teamer. I know some of those techniques, and I've seen some of the attacks, but there's a lot of these I've never seen used in the real world. So I can't think this far on my own, so you start looking through, okay, how would drive-by compromise look? What are the ways that we could stop that? You know, do we have, and what's really cool, oh, of course I don't have internet because I don't want a bunch of, I have that intentionally. So, but the cool thing about MITRE ATT&CK is that it'll give you specific examples. It'll say like this tool used by this attacker in this way. And it gets even cooler when you start comparing it, combining it with the tool that I'm going to use for building these attack flows called Attack Flow Builder. You got to remember that naming exactly. If you look up Attack Flow Mapper or Attack Path Mapper or any of those things, for some reason the SEO does not work at all and you can't find it. Attack Flow Builder. But they have a lot of really cool example flows. Not any sort of exhaustive list, but it grows almost every week. Someone come, you know, so there's some cool ones in here. Like, Dwayne was actually talking about Lapsus. Lapsus is, in my mind, is one of the scariest attackers out there, more than APTs, because they just don't give a damn. They do the most wild, because for the most part, it's a bunch of, you know, teenagers hopped up on hormones and stuff, so they're just trying crazy stuff. And Lapsus isn't actually like a group of people. I've seen people get moved in and out of Lapsus. Basically, it's seriously like a teenage high school clique. It is the craziest group. But I love this because, and so this is going to look a little different than the one I'm going to show you with how I'd actually use this for an internal like attack path map. This is more of a threat intel map, but because we're going to add slightly different things to here. But this is really cool for visualizing attacks that you might have read an article on, and this works really well for me because I like these graphs. So it'll tell you this tactic, they compromised accounts, they don't know what malware, and then the attackers purchased the credentials. Yes, they did. Well, that gave them access to a valid account, and it gives you this whole flow that then you could look at this and go, oh man, that would happen to me. Oh wait, this wouldn't happen to me because we don't allow push attacks. So maybe I could have stopped this whole thing. Well, let's think about how else we could have gotten here in our environment. And this is the kind of thought exercise. And you don't just have to make it up. The cool thing is there's hundreds in here. Look at them. A lot of these aren't going to apply to you because you'll see something like, you'll see very specific tool sets in here that don't matter for you. Avanti vulnerabilities, if you don't have Avanti, probably ignore some of it. But it's just really cool because it's no longer just like a couple lines on a chart. You can actually see the paths, and then some of these get a lot more complicated. I really like this Marriott breach where it shows that parallelness. The reality is attacks don't happen in a linear way. There's often dozens of things happening in your environment. They're not just one person hands on keyboard. There is phishing, then simultaneously they're installing remote access software and they're stealing passwords from password stores. Then they combine that information to get your network topology. Just an example. And then which one do I have here? This is just one of the more recent ones. And just showing that MITRE does constantly update these. That's one of the coolest things to me. This is an attack that was just, 9-10 months ago, exploiting a public-facing application. This is actually one of those examples of a true perimeter type breach. They install a web shell, start hijacking RDP sessions, and then this is where it starts going into these parallel attacks. And it's great to look at this and then go, could I catch that? And I know a lot of people use MITRE in this way of again, a list, when I don't think it should be used as a list. It should be used as a graph ultimately, but people use it as a checklist. Could I detect active scanning? Could I detect, that's great, fine, why not? Why not confirm that you could detect phishing? And that's a great thing for detection engineering, but it's more, what could someone do in my environment with that? I think for 90% of these lateral movement ones, the answer is just segment your damn network. You have VLANs, put in the correct blocks there. So I'm going to kind of build one right here live. Let's see how some of that works. So I'm going to start with phishing. Super ubiquitous. We've all seen it. We understand it. I know we generally call it business email compromise nowadays, but phishing, okay? So someone gets an email in your environment, they click on the link, they put in their password, okay? Now they can compromise a valid account. Well, okay, this is where the way I use this tool differs a little bit from how MITRE intends you to, because they don't have a node here for defensive control, but you just put in a note, defensive control, we have conditional access policies. Okay, start thinking about your gaps in that. So one, soapbox for a second. I have seen more attacks stopped by well-configured identity conditional access policies than anything else. I have seen hundreds of attacks per day attempted. I have seen attacks, phishing, all sorts of things that should have been successful in most environments, but you have good MFA, or you have something like managed device policy. That's one of the coolest ones, and you can have malware on someone's phone where you could steal, an MFA token. You could do things like that. But once you have this conditional access policy in depth, I see it stop so many things, because it's sure, I've compromised the person's phone, I've gotten the person's password, but I don't have a device joined to that network. I don't have a device joined to their, Entra ID or to their Okta or whatever you're using. And suddenly you're stopping it in so many ways. So I could probably give an entire talk on just the cool things you can do with Microsoft conditional access policies, but seriously, whatever your identity provider is, look at it, try and use those as much as possible. But it's important because we see this control and then we start thinking it's like this silver bullet, but it's not. You start thinking okay, what are your gaps in your conditional access policies? So that's where I'd put an asset. You have service accounts that are excluded from your conditional access because, well, a service account is maybe on a Linux distribution that isn't supported by managed device. Obviously you can't send a push notification to there are ways, but don't do it. You can't send a push notification to a service account because they aren't a real person who can read the code and type it in. So this is excluded. So now you start thinking, okay, that service account, do any of these service accounts have access to your VPN or to anything external? Could someone use that? And things like that. So start thinking, what accounts that, if stolen by phishing, are excluded? So this is where I'm going to cross the line a little bit into real world. If you've seen a place I allegedly might have worked, Dragos, very public breach a couple years back, public information, really interesting one where an employee was set to start on Monday. On Friday, their password is sent to them. And if you're a remote place, you can't always join that computer in advance because you may just drop ship laptops. You may have 20 people starting every Monday and you don't have the team to build out all those laptops, so you just drop ship it. The initial setup happens initially. So most places I've seen, you have new employees excluded from conditional access. Well, great. That means all someone has to do is compromise your Comcast account. Another aside soapbox. Comcast email is not just not secure, but definitely has some crazy internal breach where attackers have persistent bypasses of MFA. I have seen attackers persist in people's Comcast email, and I'm sure it exists for other home email, but yeah, if you or anyone you know or love, any of your employees are on Comcast email, try and get them not to. I actually consider it a control to not allow backup, like, password reset verifiers to be Comcast email addresses. Don't allow it because it's compromised. Definitely not saying that was how some company named after a dragon was breached, but yeah, and definitely not saying that Okta got breached that same week in the same method, but allegedly. But this is a real thing that could happen at your remote places where you send a user a password and they log in, and then the attacker logs in, registers the device, now they're in. So this is a great way to think, maybe where do I not have my controls strong enough, and what can I do without completely disrupting my onboarding process, And this is where non-technical comes in. The most boring thing is, don't email people the password. Zoom, have them show you an ID, boom, real life, and not that that's infallible, but a lot harder of a barrier to crack when you have the real employee emailing you going, hey, when am I doing my onboarding? And, so then service accounts, things like that. Connect to external VPN. Okay, so you start looking at that and going, well, do I have over permission here? Do I have users who don't need external VPN? Maybe let's move off of legacy VPN and do things like, I know buzzword, but zero trust network access, SASE, any of that type of stuff where, you can have more advanced conditional access policies, you can have a lot more granular things. And then you start thinking, okay, so from the VPN, what can I pivot to? And this is where the new cool stuff like Microsoft's, I forget what they're calling it, but Microsoft ZTNA or all these cool zero trust, VPN replacements. You can get very granular. You can say this user can only access this thing on this port because this user logs into the web interface, but this user actually manages the system. So you can get real granular. So start thinking about those sort of things. I could go on and on, but this is where, I'd even put something in here like maybe instead of asset, you could add a node for, so. And this is how easy it is. I will say that you could hypothetically do this in Visio. The number one reason to not do it in Visio, and this is more of a cell phone than anything, a self-own, not cell phone, Visio lines, connector lines suck. I cannot tell you how many hundreds of hours I have wasted trying to get perfect lines. And I don't know why that is. I've had people come up to me after I've given a talk or this kind of rant, and they're like, yeah, the commiseration about how Visio connectors suck, I don't know why that's the thing that resonates with people, but cool. And I actually saw a decent amount of nods more than almost anything else. But so note, I want to do a proposed control here. And then, like I just said, we're going to attach it to this and say the proposed control is don't send plain text passwords over email. that seems obvious, but sometimes people just do the most like simple thing. And this is why also shopping this with your non-security team, like your help desk. They know where the bodies are buried. You think you do as a defender, but man, the help desk are like, yeah, I can't believe you haven't implemented this control. And you're like, I didn't know that existed. I didn't know you guys were emailing plain text credentials. What? Why would you do that? Well, you didn't give me a more secure way to do it. And then you tell them, and then they do it. So don't send plain text credentials over email. Boom. And then, see, nice little snap to grid, nice little arrow, boom, so much easier than Visio. Cool. I wish I were exaggerating, but I cannot tell you seriously how many hundreds of hours I've spent in Visio trying to get stupid arrows to actually point correctly. And that's how easy this is. The cool thing about this export is actually exports to JSON. So you could then pipe this into ChatGPT and say, could you write a summary document of this? Because some people may just want to see an executive summary and not look at this. So I've done this where I've literally piped it into ChatGPT or Bing GPT or Claude. I will honestly say that Claude is the best of all of them. If you're not using Claude instead of ChatGPT, seriously try it. So much better at natural language. But pipe this JSON and then just say, describe this for me. And then you can have an executive summary because it's just natural language, but you could also then, you can't search this easily for proposed control, but you could just then, in the JSON, you can control F for anywhere you say proposed control, and then turn this graph into a list, because again, some people do need to think in lists, and then you can say, here's all the proposed controls, you can rank them, those sort of things. You can also add a lot of references and different, you can add there's schema in some of these, especially around the actions here. You can add a lot of cool things. I like to fill out as much as possible. But I could seriously just sit here in front of you and map out some of the coolest attacks I've seen, but I'm not going to do that right now. I just wanted to kind of show how easy this is, how easy it is to snap to the grid, how easy all of that is, and what I love is how many of these that they have. You can start looking at all these and say, what does a good attack path look like? And yeah, this, what I was talking about there definitely goes back to that, I'm going to go back a couple slides. Well, not moving too quick, but this process. So what I was showing you there was mostly the steps 2 and 3. The mapping this to MITRE attack, actually getting this on the graph, but getting outside perspectives. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've done this sort of exercise, shown it to a help desk, and they're like, a help desk person, and they're like, whoa, I didn't know all that. Or more likely, they actually tell you, yeah, none of that's true. Like, that's not actually how users use that system. No, people actually complain that they can't access it that way, things like that. So be willing to have your expectations challenged. I've seen it too many times when I do this sort of exercise, and I now do this everywhere I work, every client I have, I try and do this sort of thing because it's just so much more practical. So getting to the end here, TLDR. I have to actually spell out TLDR because I have given this talk too many times where people either look confused or say, what is TLDR? Y'all are on different corners of the internet than I am. Y'all probably have better mental health if you don't know what TLDR stands for. You don't spend as much time reading obscure Reddit forums, but cool, good for you. I am not in that place, but sure, TLDR. I said this before, I'm going to say it again. I may even repeat it in just my closing slides, but this is like analysis and conceptualization in depth. Attackers are using every single tool out there in the world to conceptualize what your attack surface looks like. Why aren't you? They're using Bloodhound, they're using Shodan, they're using a bunch of open source tools, they're using a million things to see where your risks are. Why aren't you adopting attacker mindsets to start? to conceptualize your environment. Why I can't tell you how many places I've been where they're like, oh no, the blue team doesn't use Bloodhound, our red team does that. And I'm like, no, use the red team tools, okay? Logic. Seriously, while you're creating these graphs, use logic and challenge your expectations. Don't just use habit and bias and say, this is how I've always done it, please don't do that. And then, really, I like graphs. Pretty graphs are pretty, and they're fun, and they work for me. So really, the TLDR here is make pretty graphs if it brings you joy. If this does not mesh with your mindset, just ignore everything I just said. And resources. So really, this is half of this. I could probably just list every single MITRE tool that you've never heard of. There's actually, MITRE has a whole OT threat model that is a great thing to look at. There's MITRE Defend, MITRE Attack, but use all the MITRE tools, use the Attack Flow Builder, use MITRE Defend. I don't define some of the more common ones that people probably know about. And then the gentleman whose name I'm forgetting from the beginning, who gave that great quote about attackers thinking graphs, defenders thinking lists. He has a really good blog there fleshing out that concept, honestly, in a much more eloquent way than I did at all in this talk. So, the slides, a slightly outdated version of these slides from about a month ago at B-Sides Atlanta is up here. If you want to yell at me on Twitter, X, whatever you call it these days, or LinkedIn, you know, shout questions at me through those mediums.
See you then.